Hello everybody and welcome to a new episode on the Mirror Lesson channel. In this video I'm going to review the OM system OM-1 with a focus on bird photography. I spent more than a month using the camera in different conditions, trying a lot of settings and testing multiple telephoto lenses in order to give you the most accurate review possible. One more thing before we begin, I'm also preparing a second video that will cover all the settings you need to know about, how and when to use them, as well as an explanation on how I configure the camera. So make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so and click on the notification icon to not miss that out. Okay, let's get started and let's begin with a quick summary of the technology inside the OM1. There is a brand new sensor whose design is completely different from the previous generation. One of the reasons for this new design is to improve the autofocus performance with something called quad pixel. In short, this means that each pixel is composed of 4 photodiodes instead of 1, or if you prefer, 1 photodiode divided into 4. In case you don't know, the photodiode is responsible for converting the incoming light into electrical signal. This solution allows phase detection autofocus to work in an X pattern on every single pixel and on the entire sensor surface. The OM1 uses a total of 1053 points, almost 10 times more than the previous models. In addition to the new sensor and the new TruePix 10 image processor, OM Digital Solutions put a lot of emphasis in the software algorithm and the AI subject detection mode. The camera analyzes contrast and colors in addition to the phase difference and is capable of recognizing a variety of subjects including cars, airplanes, dogs, cats, and birds, the latter being of special interest for us in this video. Animal subject detection is not new. Other brands have implemented it for a few years now, some with impressive results like Sony and Canon. Olympus introduced Bird AI on the M1X via firmware update with good results, but it wasn't the most impressive setting of the kind that I've tested. It didn't improve the keeper rate and, at times, it could easily mistake a bird with something else. The improvement brought to the OM1 is immediately visible. It is much faster and more reactive, and the camera not only detects the bird, but it recognizes different parts of it: body, head, and eye. Which part is prioritized depends on how large the animal is in the frame. Move closer and it will focus on the head or the eye if the latter is clearly visible. The M1X is less capable of making a distinction between head and eye. Focus is precise and rarely fails. The subject can be detected even if it is very small on the frame, meaning at a longer distance, or when partially covered by a branch or other natural elements. The following image surprised me not because focus was difficult to obtain, even by focusing on the tall grass, the goose would have been in focus, but because the camera had no problem detecting the bird despite being partially hidden in the grassland. You can see other examples of foreground elements covering parts of the subject's body, with the camera still capable of detecting the bird and focusing successfully. Now, it's fair to say that elements in front of your subject will mislead the camera at times. It's not always perfect, which is understandable. Also, if the bird is facing backwards, focus on the eye might not be 100% accurate either. The good thing is that even if the camera struggles momentarily, bird detection remains active on the subject. As soon as you have a clear composition, it will focus correctly. If you have more than one bird in the frame, you can use the AF target, aka AF area, to tell the camera which one to prioritize. I recommend to use a small target and position it on the bird that you want to focus on. The camera will still detect all the birds it can see in the frame, even those outside the autofocus target, but will give priority to the one that is inside the autofocus area. If you decide to use the all target mode, then the camera will give priority to the center of the frame. One small improvement I hope to see via firmware update is this. Although the AF target is a good way to choose a specific animal in your scene, I wish there could be a quicker way to jump from one subject to the other. For example, on the Canon R6, you can use the AF joystick to switch from one subject to the other. It is a much quicker solution than moving the AF points step by step. The other setting for animals you'll find on the OM1 is for cats and dogs, but that extends beyond just domestic pets. The camera can recognize lions, tigers, and other animals that look similar or come from the same family. During a visit to a local farm, the OM-1 was capable of detecting the eye of goats and lambs. However, depending on their position, it often focused on the nose rather than staying on the eye. This happened especially when the goat was facing me directly. The OM camera can also recognize a completely different subject, such as an elephant, although I only tested this at home with images on my computer screen, so I can't tell you how accurate this function is in the real world for all kinds of animals. I do hope OM will be able to implement more data, possibly under one setting, so we don't need to switch between different types. The OM-1 is capable of shooting at 10 frames per second in continuous mode with the mechanical shutter or with the anti-shock shutter, which is the electronic first curtain mode. With the electronic shutter, aka silent mode, the speed is much more impressive with a maximum of 50 frames per second with continuous autofocus and exposure tracking, or 120 frames per second with focus and exposure locked on the first frame. All these speeds work with RAW files at the maximum resolution. Here is a summary of the settings available along with important characteristics that I'm going to explain. If you work at 10 frames per second or 20 frames per second, you have live view with blackouts at every frame, as you can see right now. If you choose the SH1 or SH2 modes, however, you still get live view but with no blackouts. You see what the sensor is seeing with no interruptions and no lag. This is very similar to the Sony A1 and A9 series, but also the Nikon Z9 and the Fujifilm X-T3, X-T4. These settings, SH2 especially, are the best to follow difficult subjects that move erratically. Another function that is very useful for bird photographers is Pro Capture. It allows you to save images before pressing the shutter button all the way down. This isn't new to Olympus camera users, and the difference with the OM-1 is simply that you have these faster drive speeds up to 50 frames per second or 120 frames per second. The maximum number of frames you can save before pressing the shutter button is 70. This is a very cool feature to capture moments that are difficult to predict, such as a small bird flying off a tree. Moving on to the buffer test, unsurprisingly, the higher the burst rate is, the lower the buffer capabilities become. If with 10 frames per second you can maintain that speed for 18 seconds with RAW or 24 seconds with JPEG, switch to 50 frames per second and you won't even manage 3 seconds at full speed. The impressive drive speed of the OM-1 comes with a few limitations to be aware of. However, there is a positive news. Panasonic Micro Four Thirds lenses work with Pro Capture and continuous autofocus. On older cameras, you could only select the high option that blocks the autofocus on the first frame. That said, the fastest burst of 50 frames per second in the SH2 mode with continuous autofocus is available with a restricted selection of Olympus lenses that you can see right now. When using another Olympus lens or any Panasonic lens, the fastest speed with SH2 is 25 frames per second. You still get the benefit of live view and no blackouts. Other limitations to be aware of is that focus accuracy decreases with apertures smaller than f8 when selecting the SH2 speed. This is something to keep in mind when using a lens like the 100-400mm f5 6.3 and the teleconverters. Finally, the minimum shutter speed can be limited depending on the drive speed selected, as you can see right now. Alright, this is the chapter that many of you enjoy, so I spent a great amount of time at my two favorite Red Kite feeding stations trying all sorts of setting combinations as well as different lenses. The good news is that the OM-1 is an excellent improvement in comparison to any of its predecessors. It is much faster and more reactive, and the performance is very close to that of a Canon EOS R5 or R6. Personally, this is the update I was hoping to see more than any other. The absolute best keeper rate I got is this one with the following lens and settings. The green score includes perfect focus only, is the most severe score out of the two, the blue score is a more forgiving evaluation and also includes slightly soft results. Remember, you can read more about my birds in flight test, why I evaluated this way, and also see other results with other cameras on my website. I'll leave the link in the description. For reference, here is how the OM-1 compares to some of the other cameras that I've tested in the same conditions. Now, you might say that the best score of the OM-1 is disappointing because it was made with a 10 frame per second burst, but the good news is that the electronic shutter and the faster speeds of 20 frames per second, 25, and 50 frames per second gave me similar results. And remember that a difference of a few points is not very important. The takeaway here is that the drive speed doesn't affect the autofocus performance. Concerning the lenses, I tested the following and the keeper rate remains similar overall. It decreased when using teleconverters or when working at 400mm with the two zoom lenses. The Olympus 100-400 has a lower score also at 300mm, but that day was very cloudy with worse-like conditions than the previous ones, so that might have affected the performance a little. Moving on, another distinction I made is when the bird was against the sky, so a clear background, or against trees and other natural elements that make the background busier. As you can see, the score increases when there is a clear and uniform background behind the subject. With a busy background, the camera can struggle when the kite is small in the frame and close to trees or hills, whose colors and contrast can more easily be confused with the animal. It's fair to say that it doesn't happen all the time, and I got sequences that are nearly perfect, so you can achieve a close to 100% score with a single burst. However, spending many hours with the kites show that the performance is not always perfect. I've tried a lot of settings such as choosing different autofocus targets, including custom ones, changing the autofocus sensitivity, and other things, but the average score remained around 86-96%. The key parameter you always want to have enabled is the most obvious one, bird subject detection. Out of curiosity, I tried to turn it off to see how the camera would behave without it, also because I wanted to see how better the autofocus and the sensor technology were by themselves. As long as I used the large target, the keeper rate was not bad. It was better than any previous OMD cameras I've tested, and many of them don't have subject detection, so it shows that the autofocus in itself has improved. However, if I change the autofocus target to something larger, or worse, select continuous autofocus plus tracking, the results are dramatically lower. What bird detection does is that it helps the camera correct focus faster when the bird is out of focus or when focus is on the background rather than the subject. Sometimes it only takes a few frames for focus to be corrected, other times it would take 5 or 6 frames. Here is an example with a long sequence of 140 photos captured using bird subject detection. Red means out of focus, yellow means slightly soft focus. Only 3 images are out of focus, and in each case, it only took a few frames or even less to go back to perfect focus. Here is another example, only 42 images this time, but they are enough to show that continuous autofocus plus tracking without subject detection is much worse. Once the bird becomes out of focus, the camera is unable to correct it. It's okay with a plain background, but it's unreliable as soon as the surrounding is more complex. Overall, the OM-1 is a great upgrade as long as you use the right settings, but there are still a few occasions when the camera doesn't behave properly. For example, I struggled to get a good sequence when the bird came down to the water or grass to grab a piece of meat. What's annoying is that it misfocused at the most important moment, when the claws of the bird were grabbing the food. I have several sequences with 5 or more images out of focus around that precise instant. Other sequences were a bit better, but still, the frame that matters the most is the one that is blurred or slightly soft most of the time. While preparing this video, I went to photograph a local motorbike race so that I could test the motorsport subject detection mode, and again the OM-1 had a similar behavior. Here is an example where it focused on the tarmac on the foreground rather than the biker making the corner, and I'm not sure what the AI finds so interesting in this light gray area with no contrast, instead of the rider that is clearly visible. And I have more than one image like this. I found a workaround to avoid this behavior or at least reduce the chances of it happening. Use the small autofocus target. That solved the problem with the bike race. With the birds, I also tried a custom target with an horizontal shape offset by a few steps from the center. It worked with some sequences, but not all of them. Hopefully, with the processing speed and the advanced algorithm the camera has, OM will be able to release firmware updates to boost the performance and correct these imperfections. Okay, time to talk about image quality. First, let's go back to the sensor technology, and I want to start by clarifying something. The quad pixel design I mentioned at the beginning is only there to serve the autofocus. You cannot get more image resolution out of it. It is different from another type of sensor called quad Bayer. I'll leave a link to a DPreview article in the description that explains the difference very well. So the OM1 still uses 20.4 megapixel, which is the same with its predecessor, the M1 Mark III, and other Olympus cameras. But the design of the sensor is different also because it is stacked, which means more processing speed, and is back illuminated, which means better light collection. OM Digital Solutions said there is a one-stop improvement with dynamic range and two stops improvement with high ISO. Furthermore, they said that, in their opinion, the difference with 35mm format is greatly reduced. Unfortunately, my tests tell a different story. Starting with dynamic range, as you can see, the amount of shadow recovery is roughly the same between the OM1 and its predecessor, and so is the amount of noise generated as a consequence. And actually, the OM1 even shows a bit of purple color cast. In the highlights, however, the OM1 does a bit better, and you can see in this example how the camera managed to preserve a small amount of details of the sea outside, unlike the Mark III model. When it comes to ISO, the OM1 has a wider normal range than the M1 Mark III and higher values when using the extended ISO. The two stops improvement OM was talking about can be easily backed up by these specifications. However, real-world images do not show the difference one might come to expect. The OM1 noise is thinner and lower in quantity, but it is a small difference. More noticeable are the warmer look and the more vibrant colors produced by the new camera. The improvement with details and color accuracy becomes more important from ISO 6400. The M1 Mark III starts to lose color vibrance and color fidelity and is at its worst at ISO 25600, whereas the OM1 preserves the tones much better. Furthermore, from 12800 ISO, the M1 Mark III is using extended levels, unlike the OM1, which means the old camera produces more noise than the new camera. The OM1 has two extra steps, but these are extended ISO. The loss of details become more severe, and the highest value shows a visible shift in color. So, if you were hoping that the two stops improvement meant ISO 6400 on the OM1 looks like ISO 1600 on the M1 Mark III, you're probably disappointed right now. There is an improvement mainly due to color accuracy and the OM1 having a wider normal ISO range. It makes 12800 and 25600 ISO more usable if you really need that extra stopper sensitivity, but in terms of image noise, the difference is much more contained. Of course, my test was done indoor with a reduced amount of light. When you're out photographing in nature, you have more light available most of the time, so part of that noise will be less invasive. With the first image, the camera underexposed, choosing to go down to ISO 100, and I was using auto ISO there, and actually I noticed with the OM1 that metering can go wrong sometimes when shooting with the SH2 mode, but recovering the exposure in Lightroom is a no-brainer in this case despite the extended low ISO value. The second example is a typical situation where there is a lot of contrast and the camera tends to overexpose, leaving parts of the bird near the clipping zone. I managed to recover most of the details, only a few parts remain clipped. Then we have another typical example, cloudy day, slow aperture lens and birds in flight, where the ISO will inevitably go up. Note that all these photos were processed using Lightroom Classic with noise reduction and sharpness left at their default value. Then we have the inevitable comparison with a full frame sensor. I put the OM-1 side by side with the Canon R6, which has the same megapixel count but with a different aspect ratio, and the S7 IV, which has more resolution. Unsurprisingly, the OM file shows more noise in the shadows when performing a strong exposure recovery. In the highlights, however, the Micro Four Thirds camera is able to retain more details. I'm not entirely surprised by this because I had a similar findings with previous comparisons. What is interesting to note here is that if I overexpose the OM1 image by one stop, I get a similar amount of details in the highlights as the two full-frame cameras. Now if I take this advantage and apply it to the other side of the histogram, I'll get brighter shadows in the Micro Four Thirds image, and suddenly the result looks much better when compared to the Sony and Canon. That isn't to say that the quality is the same. The A7 and R6 still have less noise overall, but it shows that the difference between the two formats is not as huge as one may think at first. At high ISO, however, there is less to talk about. The OM1 generates more noise. Also to note that the Sony has more brightness by default with the same exposure settings, something I've already highlighted in my A7 IV vs R6 full comparison. I'll go a bit quicker here, so the OM1 can record 4K up to 60 frames per second in H.264, which means 8-bit, or H.265 in 10-bit, and these specs coupled with the excellent stabilization system of the camera and some lenses make it an interesting tool for wildlife video. It is possible to record handheld with a 300mm lens, 600mm equivalent, provided that you find a comfortable position to hold the camera, possibly by resting your arms somewhere to be more stable. Of course, it's not ideal for long recording sessions, but for quick recordings while walking around or stopping at heights, it can work surprisingly well. With any other system, I would need a sturdy, heavy-duty tripod designed for video makers to get usable footage with that kind of field of view. AI subject detection is available for movie recording, but you need to select continuous AF plus tracking and not just continuous autofocus in order to activate it. With static subjects, it does a great job. The autofocus is precise and stable in remaining on the subject without hesitations. Even when the duck was putting its head underwater, focus remained firm on its body. If the subject is moving, there is more hesitation and moments where it focuses a bit too far or too close. There are two settings, AF speed and AF sensitivity, to fine-tune the performance depending on how fast and predictable the subject is. Note that autofocus is not available in video mode if you adapt a 4/3 lens. In Full HD, you can record up to 240 frames per second, but keep in mind that with this high frame rate, continuous AF is not available. In situations where you can pre-focus, it is a fun mode to use to capture birds flying off or landing. The quality of the footage is acceptable. The excellent stabilization system is also very reliable for still photography. With long focal lengths such as 300mm, it is not impossible to achieve sharp shots at 1/10 of a second, but most likely that shutter speed is too slow to ensure sharpness on your subject, unless the animal is dead still. But nonetheless, this kind of performance means you can achieve good results at 1/50 of a second or 1/100 of a second. The performance can vary depending on the specific lens. Those compatible with Sync IS, like the 300mm Pro, which means sensor and optical stabilization working together, are the best solution. Note that Sync IS doesn't work with Panasonic lenses, you either prioritize the sensor or the optical stabilization. The design of the OM1 is very similar to its predecessor, the M1 Mark III, and so is the button layout. One of the differences is the grip on the new model, which is a bit deeper and taller. To be honest, I didn't feel the need for any change in this department. I've always found the M1 series to be one of the most comfortable to hold, even with large lenses such as the 300mm f4. That said, I quickly got used to it and I can even go as far as saying I prefer it now. Concerning the button, there is the extra AF on key at the rear of the new camera. Also, the front dial is no longer built around the shutter button, but placed underneath inside the grip. In the same way, the radar is found inside the body rather than on top. The OM-1 is fully weather sealed and the build quality feels really good, and the buttons and dials are very precise to use. The OM-1 has a brand new menu system, redesigned from the ground up with a graphic interface that resembles that of Canon EOS cameras. Each section has its own colors, and the navigation works horizontally rather than vertically. It's much better than the old menu, and everything is easier to find. My only criticism is that you can't use it with a touchscreen. The viewfinder is another welcome improvement, now featuring a 5.76 million dots OLED panel, which is a substantial increase from the previous 2.46 million dot panel. The magnification is slightly larger as well. When working at 120 frames per second, I didn't notice a substantial drop in resolution, which is good, and the viewfinder is comfortable to use if you wear glasses. The OM-1 takes two UHS 2 SD cards with the usual options concerning relay, backup, or file separation. You can't record video on the two cards at the same time, however. Finally, we have the battery life. In my first day out, I spent 3 hours in a nature reserve capturing around 400 photos and recording about 20 4K clips at 60 frames per second with stabilization and continuous autofocus. The battery drained down to 55% before leaving. I charged it in the car with a power bank to around 88% before arriving at the Red Kite filling station. There, I took almost 6,000 images, including bursts at 120 frames per second and 50 frames per second with and without Pro Capture, so a lot of stuff, and there was still 17% of battery left when I drove home. Overall, the performance is not bad at all, but clearly recording 4K video or using the Pro Capture modes drains the battery faster. For an intense day of shooting like mine, a second battery is essential if you don't have time to recharge. Last but not least, the OM-1 has a lot to offer when it comes to customization with function buttons, custom modes, and the My Menu section. Alright, I think it's time to wrap it up. Do I like the OM-1? Am I keeping it? Let's begin with the positive. The autofocus is without a doubt the main improvement, and I'm happy because that was my number one priority. The camera can be very close to the performance of a Canon R5 or R6. It's not at the same level of the Sony A1 or A9 Mark II, but not far either. I'll take that. It's worth noting that the autofocus seems to be limited to certain settings to really bring the best out of it. I don't see any improvements with the normal tracking mode, and disabling the AI subject detection reduces the performance. While there isn't any reason to do that when it comes to birds, I do wonder how the camera performs in other situations like, for example, portrait or football. I'll develop this topic further with another review. The continuous shooting speed is better than ever, and I can't really imagine any of us wanting more. The AF performance is consistent whether you work at 10 frames per second or 50 frames per second, and the only thing you need to be aware is that with the faster speeds, the buffer is limited. There will be cases where you want to choose 20 frames per second or 25 frames per second and be able to work at that speed for longer. But really, the point is that we're spoiled for choice, including the possibility of working with live view and no blackouts. The video improvements are welcome, but this is an area where the camera still feels somehow inferior to other products. That said, the possibility of recording 4K 60p or Full HD 240p combined with the unrivaled stabilization system makes the OM-1 a better proposition than before when it comes to wildlife filmmaking. Then we have the elephant in the room, which is image quality. The claims made in the announcement led us to believe the difference would be substantial, but on the surface, it's hard to find a wow improvement with the OM-1. That isn't to say there is nothing at all. Dynamic range is a bit better in the highlights, and color accuracy and details at high sensitivities have improved. In fact, colors in general seems to be much better on the new camera, and there is also a substantial improvement on the JPEG rendering, which is something I've skipped in this video and talk about another time. This might be enough for some of us, but at the same time, I can understand why other photographers were waiting for a more important step forward in this direction, also considering the 6 years gap between this new sensor and the previous one. With that said, my opinion on the OM-1 remains very positive. On many fronts, it is an excellent upgrade over its predecessor, and a much needed one to prove that Micro Four Thirds is not over yet. It certainly isn't revolutionary for the system, and we could argue that it could have made more of an impact if it had arrived a few years earlier, but the important thing is that it is here now. I'm also curious to see if and how the camera will receive substantial firmware updates to fix the minor issues that I found, as well as boosting the performance further and, who knows, introducing new features. So for now, I would say it's definitely a keeper. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. As always, don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any question. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.